Palisades Village, and I'm honored and really very honored to be able to introduce Tom tonight. Tom has been working on this volume, which you see right here. Here are two of them, Welfare Traditions.
Okay.
Welfare Traditions since 1500. And I think these two volumes probably will become the reference book on this subject, reference on the European traditions of welfare. He has worked on these for something like 30 years, off and on for 30 years. And it's really a magisterial, two magisterial volumes. And it's really an exceptional achievement, I think, really exceptional. We all have a story, and Tom's story is the story of the welfare state. He traces the evolution and the development of social concerns for the poor and the welfare of the community from the Renaissance to the creation and acceptance of the welfare state in the 20th and 21st century. The story begins with the developments that led to a movement in cities across Europe at the beginning of the 16th century. These movements were aimed at a reform of charitable activities and institutions. Urban leaders and elites, along with queens and kings and institutions, launched comprehensive efforts to collect and organize resources to take care of the poor and dispossessed. It's quite remarkable. At the same time, they exercised caution about not going overboard in a way that undermined the value and importance of personal work. It was a matter of finding good governance for the entire community, a matter of social policy for a balanced social order and social control. This began, as I said, in the 16th century. Tom traces how these principles of balance and good governance, social policy, and concern for the entire community evolved in national policies over the next 4 centuries, calling attention to the contributions of key figures in various European countries as national social welfare policies emerged in Europe and eventually in the United States. It has been, as he says, reform without end. We thank you for this study, Tom. Tell us more. Tell us more, please.
And for those of you on Zoom, please feel free to put any questions in the chat.
Well, thank you, Joe, for that generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank the rest of the events committee, Big Events, thanks to the rest for organizing this event, and to our host, Kathy Shrihar, for opening up her home, this very nice space here for all of you to gather, and to Eric Blanton and Anna Oran for the other arrangements. And Erica is here managing the Zoom, which also is something I very much appreciate, to reach out to a lot of old friends and colleagues, past and present. So I especially appreciate you all coming. And I will give you a little story about welfare traditions in Europe. I don't have a PowerPoint. I don't apologize for that. I have a beginning visual, and that is a painting that illustrates the works of mercy from the early 17th century. And this is it refers to one of the most famous passages in the gospel, where the disciples asked Christ, well, what can we really do for you? You know, and he said, well, you know, anytime you do something for the poor, you're really doing it for me. You're doing it to me. So, he talks about the particular things that you can do for the poor. And so the picture shows that. And I passed around a little old-fashioned handout, which has the picture on the cover of this painting by Peter Bruegel, around 1610, and it shows lay people in the public square handing out help to the poor people. Let's see, now do I have 1 and 2? They did a very nice job at the publisher of putting this painting over 2 covers. I think that's about right. I think you can see it. But anyway, in the lower left, it should be the baker and his wife are handing out loaves of bread, and a little higher up, there are townspeople who are filling up flasks of water for people so they can drink it. Lower right, there are clothes being given out for people who really don't have much on, or else what they have on is pretty tattered. And then you can't quite see it on the handout, but on the book you should be able to see in the upper right, someone's going in to look in on someone who's sick. And then a little further back, someone is taking in a traveler, a wayfarer. You can't quite see it, but a little bit over more to the left, there's a building over there, and this is a prison, I think. And people would go and visit prisoners. And that was another thing. When I was in prison, you visited me. And then way in the back, there is a body being buried. Some people who were too poor to be buried. And that was another of the works of mercy. So that's my visual thing for the evening. So I guess one point about that is that I think there's a conception that before the welfare state, the church was the only organization that helped anybody. And the church certainly had a very important role in all kinds of institutions, but civic communities considered they had a responsibility, and individuals also within those communities. And so that's what you see with these people helping in the public square. Also, the idea of poverty was very broad. It had more to do with not just how much money you had or resources, but whether you were really helpless and in dire need of some kind. So it could be hunger, misery, sickness, all kinds of categories of extreme need. And it was really considered, it was not sort of a social safety net. It was really more helping people who were in very severe need. And these categories, although some of this would continue with regular payments like to widows, provisions for orphans, and for pilgrims and travelers. So when I use the term welfare tradition, I'm not talking about the welfare state. You could say it's really talking about the backstory of the welfare state. And it's not just, I'm not saying this is just so you know what happened before the welfare state. I'm saying also, you know, tradition that really continues to inform welfare institutions of all kinds in Europe. Now, of course, we have some differences in the United States, but I'm really focusing on Europe for this purpose. So the early 16th century, as Joe mentioned, is really a critical period, and that's recognized by historians of welfare more generally, the first 2 decades especially. Welfare in those years comes to be defined more clearly as a public responsibility, and there's an interest in saying it's really not good enough to just, you know, hand out a few crumbs to someone in the street or a coin when you come out of church, but you really need to find out who the needy people are in your community. And then you need to collect the resources, the alms that people want to give, and then in a very organized way, from a common chest, give that out. And quite a number of cities, especially in Northern Europe, adopted this idea of the common chest. So I deal with this epoch, what I call the threshold of modernity, in around from 1500 to 1540, and that whole part 1 is to that refers to that period. Parts 2, 3, and 4 cover longer periods of about 150 years each, with the last part 4 really covering the features of the modern welfare state as it emerges since 1850. So I will try to bring these themes to life with stories of leading individuals and institutions. I call this sometimes a mosaic of micro-histories, a lot of stories put together to try to tell a story. And it's certainly not the complete story of welfare in Europe. That would really take an encyclopedia, and there's been a tremendous lot of good work done on those subjects. So I'll introduce you to a couple of the leading characters in each part with an explanation of the themes they represent. The book opens volume 1 with a true leading lady, Queen Leonor of Portugal, who started the Casa da Misericordia in Lisbon in 1498. She was the Dowager Queen, her brother was king, he was off arranging a marriage in Spain. And she got together the leading citizens in the cathedral in Lisbon and persuaded them to draw up a charter and commit themselves as a confraternity, a formless confraternity, to enact the works of mercy. And they referred to them, if you look at the Bible, there are really 6, but the medieval tradition turned them into 7, which I think mainly had to do with burying the dead. But there were 7 physical works and 7 spiritual works. But the confraternity really emphasized the physical works, the material aid to the poor. Now, one of the interesting things about this, in terms of the developments of the threshold of modernity, is that Leonor and her brother, King Manuel, very deliberately tried to make this Lisbon confraternity a model. So they took their charter and they sent agents around to every city in Portugal and persuaded them to try to adopt this similar confraternity. And there was royal aid given in various kinds of perks and forms and privileges to all of these confraternities. So it extended to all cities of Portugal. And then, of course, at this time, Portugal was creating an empire. And so there are Casas da Misericordia in almost every of the colonies that were settled by the Portuguese. So there is one still in Salvador de Bahia in Brazil. There was one in Goa in India, which was kind of a center for the ones that went west, which went out to Macau and then even to Nagasaki. And so this very extensive network of confraternities for the Casa de Misericordia. Now, in addition to this kind of partnership between crown and lay people, the kings of Portugal and other monarchs made an effort to consolidate charitable resources, which were very scattered in very small hospitals. And often it was just, a small chapel with prayers, masses being said for the dead, and just 2 or 3 beds for pilgrims or for someone who was sick. And that wasn't really terribly efficient. And so the idea was to build bigger hospitals, put more resources in them. And so what you have is a great number of what were called general hospitals. And you find that in Lisbon, Barcelona, Valencia, Milan, and a spread of them later, like into the 17th century. So beneath that level of kings, queens, and princes, municipal governments really took the lead in the reform of charity and welfare with these common chests, as I was describing earlier. Urban magistrates established this welfare tradition, and historians refer to this as a major innovation, replacing manual alms. To some extent, you could say it was the seat of welfare bureaucracy, but not yet with paid public servants. These would be volunteers, citizens, magistrates. The spirit and substance of this emerging model is captured in a treatise that was addressed to the citizens of Bruges in Flanders in 1526. Historians and modern experts in social policy have commented on the modernity of this treatise, which was titled, in the Latin treatise can be translated, On Relief of the Poor or of Human Need. Its author is the Spanish-born scholar Juan Luis Vives, who may never have heard of, but he is the most important figure in the whole book. And he comes back at the very end because I sort of use his basic ideas to structure the notion of a European welfare tradition. And he represents, he didn't initiate the reform, but he really synthesized what it meant and tried to, and hoped that it would be propagated. And its values I describe as an Erasmian conscience. Now that brings us to Erasmus. If you know about the European student exchange, they call that Erasmus out of great veneration for the Renaissance scholar Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, we sometimes call him, although he taught a lot in Flanders at Louvain and later moved to Basel. He was at the center of a group of scholars whom we call Christian humanists, dedicated to the restoration of classical and religious texts in Greek and Latin. They Those of you who long ago took Western Civ courses may have remembered his critique of society, The Praise of Folly, which skewered all the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to be Christian but did everything, that would have treated Christ as a fool. Thomas More certainly is another, what we know as a Catholic martyr, refusing Henry VIII's claim to supreme authority over the Church of England. And his Utopia is another humanities core course reading. He was also, not as well known, a hard-driving lawyer and trade negotiator. A vignette at the opening of his Utopia has him on the dock at Bruges, where he returned repeatedly to drive a hard bargain on behalf of the English wool interests. Bruges was the headquarters of the Hanseatic League, representing commercial interests in the port cities of Northern Europe. Vives was received there among the community of Spanish merchants and agents. And Erasmus had Vives and More meet each other there, and More would later secure the patronage of Henry VIII for Vives to teach for a time at Oxford. There's a Belgian historian, Henri Pirenne, who suggested that this new model adopted in the 16th century represented a consensus among humanists, jurists, and capitalists, or you might say scholars, lawyers, and merchants. And Vives' own upbringing and career reflects this merger consensus of values that was shared among these groups in a very unique way. I've been completely fascinated and perplexed by the story of Vives and his situation as a Christian humanist scholar imbued in the culture of Spanish conversos. His ancestors were among the Jews who had converted to Christianity, hence conversos, under duress nearly a century earlier. Although they were practicing Christians, they preserved community ties and their old burial ground. They celebrated Mass in their old synagogue. Persecution revived in Valencia in the early 16th century from fear of clandestine Jewish influence. One of Vives' ancestors had talked about an uprising. While he was in Flanders writing his treatise on the relief of the poor, his father and other family were arrested and put to death, while an ancestor was exhumed, burned, and his ashes spread on the River Turia. I still wonder how Vives could identify as a Christian scholar when all this persecution was going on, but this was not exception among conversos in early modern Spain. Brought up in a family of merchants that traded from the Mediterranean to Flanders, Vives went from school in Valencia to study at the Sorbonne in Paris, and he got kind of tired of scholasticism, as a lot of other people were at that time, and went on to Louvain, where there was a more modern development of humanist scholarship. He published a number of works and attracted the attention of Erasmus, who immediately said, "Hey, you've got to join my team," and invited him to edit a new edition of St. Augustine's City of God, which turned out to be quite a chore. There was a lot of back and forth between Erasmus and Vives about getting that edition produced. I'm just going to take a little sip here. From my reading of the Vives' work, in particular that treatise, I kind of distilled three major themes that I think carry over into the welfare tradition. The first, with, of course, in good Latin, so you have beneficence, law, and work. And beneficence was really the very basic idea of doing good, mutual aid, and a disinterested mutual aid in particular. It was a blend of Christian teaching and ancient classical authors such as Cicero, Seneca, and Aristotle, who all argued for obligation of each to act to do good to all in a spirit of mutual aid. In one of Erasmus' colloquies called The Godly Feast, around 1522, the question of charitable giving came up. And Erasmus recognized it wasn't easy to decide who you should give charity to and how much you should give. But he said there's an underlying principle that you should be thinking of doing good to everyone, whatever is appropriate. So Vives laid out a plan for determining needs and for housing those unable to care for themselves and providing care and activity. And the second theme is law. Vives agreed with others in Erasmus' circle that law had to be an instrument for public good, and that measures for the relief of the poor had to be carefully maintained and renewed like any public facility. When he's in his treatise, when he's talking to the leading citizens of Bruges, which was close to the ocean, had canals and docks. He compares poor law measures to the local infrastructure with the action to maintain bridges and canals. It needs constant maintenance and rethinking and reform. So Vives' view of law as a positive force in government society was influenced by his own uncle back in Valencia, who told him about the principle of the justice and good in Roman law. And he praised Justinian and Ulpian and the others who had stated these classic principles of law, of Roman law. And the third basic principle is evaluation of work. Erasmus is known for his condemnation of lazy monks and so on. And Erasmus and Vives felt that the high value placed by the church on vows of poverty and a life of prayer and contemplation tended to undermine the value of honest work. They saw work which could take many forms, including the life of the scholar, of course, not as punishment for sin, but as a necessary form of human fulfillment. Beggars who were able-bodied should not be allowed to languish in idleness and squalor, but should be required to work for a living. So I conclude on this that in the very end of the second volume, I suggested this view of welfare continued as a living tradition in various forms to this day. I much more in part one of the book. I give you a travelogue of Siena, Florence, Milan, and Lyon to talk about their hospitals and their municipal charities. But let me pass quickly over to the gritty theme of discipline, which is the title of part two. This concept, that is discipline, which I situate in the period from 1540 to 1700, takes many forms, but it was really overshadowed by the religious conflict that stirred up by the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic response. And this continues through into the 17th century. Each of the religious confessions wants discipline in order to purge abuses, to reform, to get rid of whatever is not the pure tradition, get back to basics, but also to gird their loins for battle against the religious enemy. So Erasmus certainly had an idea of discipline in order, the ordered community, get rid of abuses, start living up to the gospel. But I would suggest that in this heated atmosphere, the devotion to order and rationality intensify, and you might say even that they are weaponized. So you have leading figures that are familiar, John Calvin, Loyola, and others in various cities, Zwingli and Bucer and others. Although they were earlier. I'm sorry, I got off track a little there. So the upshot in Tudor England was that the monasteries were dissolved. There was a concern that their charity would be missing. Henry VIII secularized ecclesiastical property. And one outcome of this was the creation of an English poor law, which was finally set in its final form in the end of Elizabeth's reign, around 1601. Similar secularization of church properties took place in German Lutheran Calvinist lands. Philip of Hesse, who was a Lutheran prince, confiscated ecclesiastical property and established a hospital, which was very impressive and lasted for centuries. Now, on the Catholic side, I take the story of the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan, Carlo Borromeo, who represents the model approach taken by the Catholic Church. At the Council of Trent, which was where all of the bishops of the Catholic Church under papal authority addressed both issues of reform and how they were going to push back on the Protestant challenge. And one of the key points of that in terms of discipline was to reaffirm the central duties of the bishop. And one of the duties of the bishop was to oversee charity and charitable establishments. And Carlo Borromeo was very active in that field and makes for an interesting story there. Well, let me move quickly on to volume 2. And there we move to the French Revolution as one of the core developments. And I skip over a lot of things that I have in those parts 3 and 4. But just to focus on that, I use in the frontispiece for volume 2 something that came out of the French Revolution, which was called the Book of National Beneficence. Although it sounds better in French because they use the word bienfaisance, which is, doing good, but in a big enlightenment way. Livre de la bienfaisance nationale. So this was a key word, but it was instituted by the French revolutionary Jacobins right at the height of the terror, in fact, on 22 Floréal in the revolutionary calendar, just weeks before the fall of Robespierre in July 1794. Now, to go back a little earlier in the revolution, 1790-91, the Committee on Mendicity of the Constituent Assembly had proposed a comprehensive system of public assistance, and that really carried through, inspired further debates up until the time of the terror. The Jacobin Convention took the task further in its final days, and it decreed that officials in each department should draw up a list of those entitled to receive relief from a set allocation by the nation. It was a bare bones entitlement, but it set a precedent, a system of welfare which, in principle at least, the ordinary citizen was the person who would have official entitlement to relief according to standard principles, and he would also take part in legislating the provisions that supported that entitlement. So this is really a component in the modern development of what could be called democratic citizenship, and particularly in the social domain, democratic social citizen. Among the cast of characters that you might enjoy meeting in the revolution, the strong-willed reforming aristocrat, the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt, or Liancourt for short, has a large role as chairman of the Committee on Mendicity. He articulated this notion that the state had an obligation to relieve need in equal fashion, and he really saw that it has to be a national system. It had to be funded out of the national treasury. And the matter of executed required expertise and knowledge and inquiry to determine the need, and on a national level, maybe it's an extension of that urban notion of the 16th century. But he saw this, in his words, literally a political science. And its administration was on a par with all of the other functions of national government. Now, being an aristocrat, he didn't find it convenient to stay through the terror, so he went to England and also to the United States, where he actually got quite interested in the prisons of Philadelphia and wrote a pamphlet about their effort at reforming the prisons. So I also highlight a truly obscure figure, the Abbé Leclerc de Molyneux, who started as an old regime reformer, steeped in the Enlightenment, and with an experiment on how to reform beggars, treating them in their workhouses in a slightly different way than they had been previously, giving them chances for consumption and a clean environment and a certain amount of dignity. And he worked closely with Liancourt on Liancourt's committee. Although he was hired by the Jacobin Committee of Public Safety to draft that key measure that I referred to, he survived as a bureaucrat who took on a large responsibility for picking up the pieces of the revolutionary welfare efforts. The government that succeeded the terror retreated from the principle of a universal right to assistance in need. And so there was kind of a legacy, but it was just a matter of picking up the pieces, and welfare really was reduced to what could be done on a very local level. After the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, France experienced two more outbreaks of revolution before settling for the return of Napoleon's nephew and the founding of the Second Empire. The social question loomed large from the 1830s, when, for example, when silk workers in Lyon went on a violent strike and vowed that they would either live by their work or die fighting. So that was sort of the spirit of these 19th century workers' movements. So, I'm sorry, not fighting. The title of part 3 is actually The Grumbling Hive, which refers to a poem by the English writer Bernard Mandeville called Fable of the Bees. And he argued that charity schools and work projects were counterproductive, and that in fact, you shouldn't worry about the vices of a commercial society, because that's what really made for national prosperity. And he had this rather scandalous motto that private vices are public benefits. While it was an overstatement, it captured the growing confidence among writers on political economy that market forces left to their own would produce the greatest benefits. In England, this current thought led to intensive criticism of the poor law. At the same time, English philanthropists ignored Mandeville and established a whole range of philanthropies, such as the London Foundling Hospital, which was the result of efforts of a colorful shipbuilder, Thomas Coram. And I recommend, if you were in London, definitely go to the Foundling London Foundling Museum. It's absolutely fascinating place. On the top floor, they have a whole room in honor of Handel, because Handel was one of the trustees for the foundling home, and dedicated the first performance of the Messiah. It was a benefit performance for the home. So this foundling hospital is illustrated in volume 2 with an engraving after Hogarth, who was also involved with the hospital. Part 3 features a Dickensian cast of characters, including Charles Dickens himself, who lived near Workhouse for a while and got involved in the reform of their infirmaries. And I also make a place for the Scotsman agricultural John Sinclair, who promoted the collection of statistics as a foundation for social policy, and another for the utopian Robert Owen. Toward the end of part 3, I treat the failed revolutions of 1848 as a dress rehearsal for the reforms and movements that emerged later. A key figure in that heady year of hope was the doctor of the Berlin Charité Hospital, Rudolf Virchow, you can pronounce it various ways, but I've been told that's how they did it in his part of the country, who published a weekly medical journal as the revolution waxed and waned. And he insisted that the benefits of medicine and public health could not be expected to reach the people at large without fully democratic institutions. And in his view, the Prussian monarchy stood condemned by its failures in handling the Silesian epidemic. And after years of exile in Würzburg, Rudolf Virchow returned to Berlin as a liberal politician, public health reformer, and advocate of science as a foundation for civic life. So I come to part 4, the last section, where I really do try to deal more with the welfare state and how it carries on and develops these traditions. And I talk about intertwined trajectories, because each nation state had its own systems, its own political dynamics, but they communicated with each other and they watched what each other was doing, and they did a lot of things based on the same models. Always had others in views. And there was one Danish social scientist who later talked about social competition among countries in Europe for who could come up with the most effective arrangements and social experiments. So let me say a little bit more about each area. In Germany, you have to talk a little bit about Bismarck, of course, but I also found absolutely fascinating the autobiography of Alice Salomon, who obtained a doctorate in the 1880s and founded a school of social welfare. She had international links with Britain and also with Jane Addams in the United States. I deal with difficulty with the tragedies of Weimar and the Third Reich, and then come to the rebuilding of the welfare state, a lot of it incorporating Bismarck's models, because that sort of had implanted itself. And social science talks about path dependency. It's very hard to shake up a pattern that's already been institutionalized. But the Germans often talk about 1945 as 0 hour. I'm not giving you my German, Stunde Null. Okay, and from there they built up what they call the Sozialstaat, or the German welfare state. And it's interesting, that term only took on rather gradually. It wasn't really purely in the Constitution. Now, the socialists had some part to do, and everyone knows the name of Willy Brandt, but really the Christian Democrats were the central players in building the German welfare state. And you all, I'm sure, have heard of Konrad Adenauer, who had been the former mayor of Cologne. He really navigated the coalitions, and especially first with the pension law. With all the discussion of age in public life today, I'm always amused by the fact that they lovingly called him Der Alte, the old guy. Anyway, later it was Helmut Kohl who guided Germany and its welfare system through the period of reunification with the DDR. In England, you may all be familiar with the Beveridge Report of 1943, which was really the founding document of the post-war welfare state. It was the blueprint for what the Labour government carried out in its term of office before things turned back to conservatives. And in that report, he invoked John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress with the promise of doing away with what Bunyan called the 5 giants: want, hunger, idleness, disease, and ignorance. And so it was, they almost had this religious tone behind some of the welfare state, what the emotion driving the conviction that this was needed. Now, one point I go in the way I developed the English part was to go backwards, because looking both at Beveridge and other performers, the 1880s really laid the foundation for a lot of the development that went through the early 20th century and up to the Beveridge report. And by 1880s, there was adult male suffrage and the rise of industrial unions. And Beveridge was very interested at an early age in social issues. He was a member of the Settlement House, Toynbee Hall in London for a time. And he was very interested in studying the phenomenon of unemployment. And he came acquainted with another person who you may or may not have heard of, Beatrice Webb. Her main name was Potter, who started out her interest in social work with the study of the London poor that was carried out by Charles Booth. She was an investigator on that study and then went on to really become a very active leader affiliated with the emerging Labour Party. And she took part in a report on the Poor Law in 1910, which really set some of the goals of the Minority Court for what the Labour Party would later try to do. And for England, I have some cameo appearances, Labour figures like Keir Hardie, Nye Bevan, your usual suspects like Churchill, who was very active on social matters early in his career, Lloyd George, and then of course, in the later period, the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. Had to talk about her at the end. So for France, you had the revival of fraternité in the Third Republic after the violence of the Commune was over and things settled down again. But it was recast with a new term by the radical politicians who spoke of a doctrine of solidarism, or solidarity, of important how having public institutions bring solidarity out of its people. The rise of the socialists, led particularly by Jean Jaurès, who was assassinated on the eve of World War I, was important in that. Much was disrupted all over the continent, France in particular, with the split between socialists and communists that was provoked by the Russian Revolution and the call for Moscow to rally behind the true socialist revolution. Now, in talking about France, I have a couple of mosaics, little biography, figures who I think you'd find very interesting. One is the legal scholar René Cassin, who fought in World War I, and he was so badly wounded, and he also suffered terribly from a very bad medical corps that he was subjected to. And after he finally recovered, he threw himself into veterans' rights, not only for the French, but also for the Germans. And he also got involved in the League of Nations and the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And then he is especially noted for his work with Eleanor Roosevelt and others in framing the Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. So that's a figure that's woven through the history of the welfare state in France, as well as another jurist, Pierre Larocque, a fascinating biography. I have to just tell you a few words. I know I'm taking a lot of time here, but I don't have too much. So I'll tell you, Larocque grew up in Paris and a very ambitious young lawyer, and he rose to the highest levels of French government, what's called the Conseil d'Etat. And that's not like anything we have here. It's almost a combination of the cabinet and the Supreme Court, so that it helps review laws in preparation, and then it also responds to the issues that arise from their application. Now, after the German invasion, his Jewish background on his mother's side came to the notice of the authorities, and so he lost his position. And he went to join associates, the people that he knew in Lyon, and got in touch with various people who were in the resistance. And there's a very dramatic story of how he was plucked out of a field in not far from Lyon by these intrepid British aviators who would fly their planes in from England and pick up people to take them to London to work with Charles de Gaulle on really a government in exile. And with the Normandy landing, he was right there right behind the troops and in Cotentin, Saint-Lô, setting up a bureau of the French government trying to immediately restore French authority. And before long, he was called upon because of his background in the kinds of law he had worked with, to see if he would take charge of setting up a system of social security. And he really is the father of the modern French social welfare state. So he is a rather interesting figure. Everyone talking about welfare states, you'd want to know about Scandinavia. And I have a little section there on the Nordic model, which scholars, I remember attending a conference where there was a collective work being done on, they insisted on saying the Nordic model and the 5 exceptions, because they, of course, have their own characteristics. Scandinavia attracted a lot of attention in the United States early on. In the 1930s, Marcus Childs wrote a book called The Middle Way. Middle, of course, between Soviet communism and liberal democracy in the West. And he especially social legislation. Another couple of interesting people are Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, who were sociologists, and they had a role in propagating ideas of what the French called the people, what the Swedes called the people's home. So I end up in the narrative part about the European Union. And there I go and take off on a separate path here, someone you've never heard of, but a very interesting Italian named Altieri Spinelli, who gave a federalist perspective on this push to go beyond a commercial union among Europe to political and social collective identity. He was a prisoner under Mussolini from early time, and Mussolini sent a bunch of political prisoners off to an island of Ventotene. And of course, the prisoners would talk and come up with their ideas, and they had an idea for what a democratic Europe should look like after the war, which was famously known as the Ventotene Manifesto. And Spinelli pursued this all the way through up to a famous turning point in the EU called the Single European Act in 1986. And he had struggled in the European Parliament with other members to create something more of a political constitutional framework. Well, the councils of ministers that met weren't totally happy with moving this quickly. And so it remained pretty much as it was, a totally commercial arrangement. And Spinelli said he felt a little bit like the old man in the sea. He hauled in this big fish, he thought, and then it got eaten up by the time he got to the dock. There was a succession of efforts to put social rights on the map, several social charters, Council of Europe, EEC, things got written into the Maastricht Treaty, Amsterdam, and then the big move forward with the big council at Nice in 2000, which had a huge agenda because it partly meant receiving applications from all the new states in Eastern Europe that wanted to join, but they also had a big social agenda. And among other things, they drafted a Charter of Fundamental Social Rights, which became incorporated into the agreements of 2009. I certainly had trouble sometimes puzzling out how the EU worked, and I love the description of one of the writers on EU who talked about the origami of the EU. One of the arrangements that they did come up with was called the Open Method of Coordination for Welfare Arrangements. And it was just a consultative thing, but it meant for more transparency, more exchange of models, how you do things well, critiquing each other's institutions and so on. And with more time, I would have said more about the constant exchange of experience over centuries, but it really does begin with the revolution of the print media back in 1500. You find an early treatise about, or publication about how the Ospedale Maggiore of Milan is running its affairs and its regulation is how it spends its money. And so that you had a model there that was shared and also was justifying how they did their work. So this exchange of information has been around for centuries. So I conclude with my conclusion, imagining Queen Leonor coming back to Lisbon for the EU summit in 2000. Is there anything familiar? Not the origami of the EU, but the role of the state in promoting models of civic action was there. She would be pleased to see that the Casa de Misericordia continues its works, much diminished, but it's in partnership with state agencies, as the EU now encourages for NGOs to work with the state agencies. And she would certainly not be unfamiliar with globalization and the role of commerce in promoting prosperity and tax revenue. And certainly the needs outlined in the 7 Works of Mercy are still around to be served. Well, I cap it off with a little prognosis, which I would just say reflects on the themes of equality and sustainability. And I invoke a number of writers who are really more knowledgeable about this. You may know the work of Amartya Sen. I first read his book about development as freedom. And I think the most important idea he had really is that human capability has to be at the center of all of this social thought, social legislation. What can the individual person do? What is he or she capable of? And how does the community help promote that capability? So leaving that, I'm looking forward to your questions, comments, and observations.
Thank you, Tom. That was wonderful.
Thank you, Rick.
Can I kick off with the first question?
Please do.
So the villages, I see as a prime example of 21st century mutual aid societies.
Uh-huh.
Is there sort of a comparable history of secular mutual aid societies in Europe going back in history?
There is a lot of mutual aid, and in fact, confraternities in the Middle Ages provided mutual aid. That was one of the main reasons for having a guild. And often it was because burial was costly, and the member of the guild would have a good procession. They would have a banquet afterwards, of course. And so the fund that they collected, the mutual aid thing, and confraternities of all sorts were forms of mutual aid. And in England, they had what was called, I think, a beer ale, an ale, something. Anyway, they drank a lot and they raised money.
Doesn't sound familiar at all.
But it's interesting if you jump all the way to like the beverage plant. You know, there certainly was a concern that all of turning everything to bureaucracy, health and everything, was going to shut out any kind of private initiative. You know, well, they did make allowances. People could still go and find a Harley Street doctor if they want. But more important, there was Beveridge himself had a 3rd report, which was about the future for private initiative and associations, which he saw as part of that life. And there's been some interesting study by scholars recently about all these kinds of associations and where they've gone to given their change imposed by the welfare state. And for example, there was an organization called Women's Voluntary Service, WVS in England, which was very active, provided all kinds of services to people. And it kind of shifted from providing very basic needs to providing more social needs.
I wonder if you could speak to the inevitable tension between welfare, helping the needy, and the need for society to remain productive. Because that is a constant dilemma, I think. Americans really struggle with this. Right now, there is resentment against those who receive more than others. Like this song, you know, Richmond, north of Richmond, or whatever. I mean, that's what that's about. The sense of inequity. Can you speak to that? How has that changed over these centuries? And this tension between giving and a productive society?
Well, it has many dimensions. I guess a lot of people make the counter argument, and certainly it was the argument of Jacques Delors when he was promoting the Maastricht Treaty, that if you had a good social welfare system, you're going to be more productive. And a lot of scholars have made that point very effectively, I think. But so this had another dimension, of course, is that a continuing counterpoint to the notion of this Erasmian conscience is the feeling, which is even in Erasmus too, of course, that this great division between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, you know, the loafers, the people that you want to discourage. And, if you have a good system of relief, you're less likely to have the undeserving poor. That's what I would say is one of the major issues. So the question of productivity has so many dimensions, but it means, as we see now in our society, whether people are even able to get to work in the morning, transportation, housing, education, and societies deal with that in different ways. So I remember a discussion with one lecturer about whether you should include education and welfare. No, that's not, education is not welfare, but it's certainly part of well-being and a productive system, and it's complementary to public assistance to have an education system that makes people capable of not going on welfare, not needing it. I think also there is a real problem of dependency where public handouts really are the only solution. We haven't figured out more constructive arrangements for productivity and a lot of other things. But education is so important to building that capability, which keeps people productive. And how much state direction should there be for that? The Germans have a very elaborate system for calibrating economic needs with education. How many people do we need for this particular technical ability, and then issuing encouragement, not knocking people over the heads, but saying, we encourage you, we'll give you support if you want to study this particular trade. And there is a much more vocational aspect to a lot of welfare state approach to education in Europe.
Thank you.
This guy.
Yeah, I really appreciate everything you said, particularly the changing concept of welfare to workers' rights and human rights. And there's a lot of criticism of welfare, as you know, recently, changing to we should change power relationships. We should not have charity. We should, Saul Alinsky, for example. And I don't know whether you've covered, how much you've covered any of that in the later part of your book.
Well, of course, there are, in a lot of social movements, there are, especially workers, and I touch on this particularly in the case of France, who said, we don't want anything to do with your welfare measures.
Right.
The unions are going to take care of us, the syndicat, and we're gonna punch the worker or the employer on the nose and make sure he shapes up, and we'll fight this out ourselves, and then of course there's a real problem, when liberal democratic institutions don't function, or they function only for a very small elite, and that was certainly true in the early 19th century France, when those institutions were really, just as Marx said, I think the working committee of the bourgeoisie or whatever, but I mean, it's still an issue up to Lloyd George about, who's running the country, who really has the power to even legislate welfare arrangements. But there's a tension with some claims that the state is not the best agent for doing this. And I think the Europeans have come around quite a bit to saying it would be helpful to have a little bit more, voluntarism. But it's not disappeared. A lot of it has gone international. Like, tremendous work of charity on an international scale. But there are people like the Abbé Pierre in the 1950s in Paris who brought attention to starving people in Paris and created a big, public effort in favor of it.
But then there's a lot of protest, just because you talked about it, Marshall, and he happens to be a good friend of mine, and Marshall Sen, who won the Nobel Prize, and they because India which used to be a democratic country, is no longer one, and the government of India has just taken his house away. He cannot no longer go home, even though he was a Nobel Peace Prize winner and is a professor at Harvard. They've taken his house away because he is fighting for the other concept of welfare, which is changing power relationships.
What are they taking away?
His home. He lives half in Harvard and he lives half in Calcutta, and the government of India has taken his home away. He can't go back.
Well, you may, and I don't know exactly which way this works, but you may know if you know him personally. But I mentioned Altieri Spinelli. I think they're related. I mean, I think Spinelli married Sen's daughter or the other way around. I can't remember now exactly which way it is.
He's had a number of relationships.
But no, Sen, I mean, I just love the way he writes and
But the consequences of not welfare, but changing power relationships and human rights are sad consequences when you don't no longer have a democratic society.
well, now tell me what I'd be curious because I don't know exactly what he was, Sen was pushing for in terms of changing power relationships. Was he talking about the Constitution or about rights in India?
No, not the Constitution. India has a good constitution. It's just not necessarily implemented yet. So,
Okay.
no. So, anyway, I'm sorry. I didn't want to.
Yes.
Europe was surrounded by some important empires early on in the course of your research and writing. The Moors in Spain must have had some sort of welfare system. The Ottomans must have had a system. The Safavids in Persia must have had something. Did you see any intercourse with these other empires compared to the European, not empire, but the accumulation of states?
You know, I think there must be, but it's sort of peripheral to what I've seen in the sources I've looked at and the studies I've looked at. There's a good work being done on welfare in like in Egypt and its background, and in India and in many places. So I really don't know, because there's also the question about the Jewish influence on welfare institutions. Clearly, there are Jewish figures who play a very important role. But I would just say one very abstract kind of thing that has struck me from the little bit I know about Islam. Islam has this thing I think called zakat, which is, I think, obligatory aid. You absolutely owe this. But then you also have voluntary. As a person, you're encouraged just to reach out individually on your own and do over and above what's required. And I think the Christian church also has that principle. You owe your tithe, but then you should also be charitable on an individual basis. And I think in Judaism, I think there's a similar division of what's owed, communally and what is individual.
And a footnote to that, when the Ford Foundation was considering its original charter, they set about to study the history of foundations. They found three really old ones. One in Persia, which was to compensate servant girls who broke dishes in the master's house. And I think two someplace in the Palestine area to take care of cats, state cats.
Well, so I think that notion of the foundation is, centered in the mosque in Islam, which collects the resources to distribute for need. So the foundation. There was another question.
Oh, we have one other chat as well.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Could you comment on the changes in the welfare tradition that followed upon the Keynesian revolution in economics?
Well, that's rather interesting. When I was reading about the Nordic welfare state, it turns out that there was an economist in Denmark, I think, who really anticipated Keynes with this notion of how expenditure affects the economy, and Keynesian was that public expenditure can stimulate the economy. I don't really know. I'm not an economist, and I think Keynesianism may have encouraged welfare spending at some point, but I think it's certainly been seen to have its limits. But I would really not feel prepared to comment on how that's evolved in discussions about welfare. I do think there has been this critique that of the idea that welfare spending detracts from productivity. And there was a article whether welfare is a watering pot or leaky bucket. You know, how is it affecting? Whether it's a leaky bucket, whether welfare is a leaky bucket, or whether actually it helps promote growth.
Okay, of course.
Yeah, Joe.
You seem to suggest that there is a sudden burst of activity on these issues in the 16th century, particularly in the cities. Is there any reason for that? Is there some natural event that was a catastrophe? And there are a lot more people around and poor people around than there used to be.
I don't think I could answer that completely. I know I always figured that one important thing was the media revolution, because the exchange of ideas was just so intensified. But the other thing to remember
But
is,
by that you mean the printing press, is
Yeah.
that right?
yeah,
Yeah.
by print. So people were exchanging what they did. Religious reform also had an impact. Now there's a big debate whether Lutheranism was really the driving force of welfare reform. And there were various Lutheran towns were very active in carrying out welfare reform. But the chronology seems to make it more that Lutheran was an accelerating factor of a movement that was already going on in the cities. And also, it wasn't entirely new. There were cities, especially in Flanders, that would draw up lists of who was needy and so on and try to allocate it regularly. So the idea wasn't entirely new. It just seems to have come together and accelerated in those early decades. And also, I would say that when I talk about, don't think that the church did everything, for charity, that the Italian city-states had a very active civic consciousness about the responsibility, the kind of a patriarchal idea of how their reputation was, whether they served the citizens of the city. Now, often they were too greedy and took too much themselves, and then the workers rose up and started burning houses down and so on. So there was kind of a balance of how much the elites would extract and how much they would realize they couldn't extract too much. So there's a balance also of keeping their businesses going, their wonderful textile trade, because that was tremendously remunerative. I mean, what Florence earned and Lucca from their textiles was simply amazing, but then their workers had to be supported. If for a while business wasn't good, then they would have to bring in, or if there was a food shortage, there was a concern for maintaining the subsistence of the lower orders in the city.
Were the lower orders given to revolt or rebellion or difficulty in cities?
On the
Did you
slightest
run into
notice,
that?
no, they were. No, and especially over food supplies.
Over what?
Food supplies.
Food supplies.
Because there's always, all through the early modern period, there was this suspicion that people were hoarding, which in fact they were, because people would get their grain stores and they say, well, is this the best time to sell, or should I wait till things are a little shorter and I can get more money from that grain? And so the market in food products often raised a lot of tension and suspicion, and the urban councils would try to moderate that if they saw it getting out of hand. But if it did get out of hand, like in Lyon in 1531, they just stormed into every storehouse in the city when the food shortage was short, and appropriated the grain.
I've got a question for you.
Frank
What
has
do
one.
you think about the concept of universal basic income, which is not welfare, but it bears on that? The idea that.
Excuse me, could you talk just a little louder? Wait, I can't hear
Oh,
you.
I'm sorry. I was asking what Tom thinks about the concept of universal basic income, which is, it's not welfare, but it's related.
Yeah.
And the idea is very simple, that you would give a floor of some kind to everybody.
Yeah.
A basic minimum floor.
Right.
And it would eliminate all the other welfare programs.
Well, there have been experimental projects in that, I think I remember.
Yeah, there are a number of them.
At the University of Wisconsin, remember, Peggy,
Finland has done a lot with that.
they try some of that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, I think it's a pretty radical suggestion,
is.
and a lot of it depends on the culture. And, you know, people say, oh, it wouldn't work in the United States because our culture is different. But what is our culture really? You know, I mean, so what are pieces have to fit together in order to make something like universal basic income work? I think it's always exaggerated how much people are going to take advantage of money if they could use it to become independent. I think in our culture, people, I'd say the majority don't like to feel dependent. But on the other hand, unfortunately, there probably are quite a number who just become accustomed to that being the only route for them to take.
But you have to re-educate people because everybody always wants more, especially when it comes to money. And with the pandemic, people were all hoarding stuff in their houses because we're not gonna have food. I mean, all these rumors get started and people just go crazy, they get carried away. It's just the human condition.
Frank had a question and then Sally.
So in terms of economics, you know, we're talking here a lot really about the distribution of income within a society. Okay, and you know, you can have what you call social welfare function, but no one can really tell you what is the optimal. Okay, what they can do in the fact is to move you from a suboptimal situation into a better, more efficient one, where everyone is at least as well off as before, at least one person is better off. So in terms of, you know, these things over time, we've had various experiments, but they've not, you know, looked at that, you know, it's really sort of saying, well, we want to accomplish something in a negative income tax program or something else. And economics can tell you things like that, but they can't tell you what's the best situation for society.
So, yeah, I mean, there are many ways of looking what the optimal is. I think, you know, extreme inequality, I think often creates a lot of problems, especially if it means that some really lose out and have trouble, you know, making ends meet at all, having a decent life. And that creates a lot of social tension. And then, you know, there Finland, I remember a story in the Washington Post about why are people in Finland so happy? they are one of the most equal in terms of income of any country in the world, I think. Yeah. But there is still room for enterprise. I'm not sure you would get the huge enterprising capitalists. They may not have enough money to do that. So I mean, that's another question. And if you have a social system which has a great deal more equality, you have to invent some ways of creating the assets to do big things. You know, I don't know.
Sally, you have a question?
Yes, for Scotland. I heard you say something about Sinclair and data collection. What was the significance of data collection?
Oh, that's an interesting subject. It really gets started with some of the British merchants and calculators back in the 17th century who were doing things such as adjusting insurance rates and mortality tables and so on. You know, in order to figure out for an insurance company whether they're going to be able to stay alive, they have to adjust their premiums so that they still make money. They insure people, there was interest also in disease and mortality, there's a man named John Grant who examined the London's tables of mortality and organized them in order to interpret what were the causes of people dying in London, that kind of thing. Medicine had a huge amount to do with collection of data, and in the 18th century, doctors were taking a lot of information about cases and reducing them to numbers as well. What John Sinclair did was collect comparable available data for every county in Scotland across the board. All kinds of agricultural data, especially what she was interested in. But he also collected data about poverty and business investment and economics. So there's a wonderful website, and I cite it in the book, at Edinburgh, where there's a wonderful explanation of how that whole system worked. And then they have a huge data set there online that makes available the original published data from that.
Then how was the data used? How was it used in terms of welfare?
Well, it's used to partly determine where there is the greatest need, where there's the economy is suffering, and so
That was a long time ago, or just is it contemporary use?
I think to really be targeted, it's more recent that it had really targeted uses. There was sort of a general interest in the 18th century in the movement called cameralism, where rulers were very interested in the state of well-being of their subjects, and so they would collect data on that. They were also interested in promoting industry, more that than actually direct welfare. But on the other hand, they did at the same time promote investment in hospitals and in medicine. But that's a question I should probably probe into myself more deeply. How it was actually used, how the data was actually used in the early time. But someone wrote at that time that without good data, people were talking about reforming the poor law or just walking in the dark. So they really have to know how much is being spent, what it's being spent for, if you want to reform it at all. So in England, there was certainly a lot of discussion of that. And in the Committee on Mendicity in France, they collected a lot of data also. It wasn't very good data, but they tried to at least estimate, from what they had, so that they could figure out how much money would have to be raised by the Treasury if they wanted to meet the minimum needs for what that they projected.
So there, part of the impulse in charitable society taking on charity is compassionate care. But there's also another side of it, and it is a means of preventing social unrest, revolution, whatever. Do you see that in your studies in European societies?
Oh yes.
Is that a basic impulse as well?
No, I think there are definitely those two sides, and I think often the magistrates are very concerned about social stability, probably above all. One indicator, I think, of the notion of wanting to maintain a stable hierarchy is the whole phenomenon that was described as the shamefaced poor, and each country has its own term for that. Les pauvres honteux in France, poveri vergognosi in Italy, people who had fallen in status and they couldn't maintain their former position. And so it's interesting that in Italy, for example, that the help for those people, it tended to be more generous because it costs more to maintain their status than the very small amounts just to keep bare subsistence for the people right at the bottom. But the other side of the coin, you talk about compassionate care. I think that can easily be underrated, and there too, you often get to the religious who did this kind of work. And there's a wonderful book, Study of Hospitals, which talks about the kind of work that was done in hospitals just to care for people, because hospitals in the old days, the main support for health was just to give people some food and rest, more than anything else, and just to bathe them and make them comfortable and hope that nature would cure them. That was, although surgeons were able to set bones and do a number of things, and they had some good herb remedies and so on. But mainly it was compassionate care in the hospitals, which was often hard to profit if the hospital wards were overcrowded and unclean. So people sometimes said go to the hospital to die, because it wasn't always too healthy. Ms. Guinea?
I just want to say it's a wonderful subject. Thank you for giving us some information on that. But don't you think that it's much more wide, that subject, because it involves the government, the top, everything is interrelated. And how, for example, in the case, from what I understand, La Casa Misericordia that was started, well, she was actually the church, she was the government, they were in charge. But if in a country, the government is corrupt, and all the money that comes from, let's say, in the country I'm thinking right now, from petrol, from gas, and then instead of starting to develop the industry to be work to get a society that is balanced, middle class or whatever, the government takes everything and put it in their pocket. And that's terrible because you get so much poor people after this, and there's no welfare because there's no state that is taking care of these people. They're just putting everything in their pockets, and it could be a government that is corrupt, but it can also be where there are too much emphasis in making money and not having a middle class and not distributing the help. Because as you said earlier, the country cannot survive if you do not have enough resources for, let's say, the middle class, or it's not balanced. It's all interrelated. Today we see that in science, it's like in ecology. You need to have all these things functioning and having to be sustainable. It's very wide.
Yeah. No, I think maintaining the welfare state is always a huge challenge. Even if there isn't widespread corruption, there is still a question of equity and transparency.
Exactly.
And all of these questions. And then also assistance is just one form of social policy. There are all these others. And a quotation comes to mind, which I used in the introduction, maybe because it's in French, I think you might appreciate it. But no, I'll give it to you later. But it's basically what, before the Committee on Mendicity, there was a committee under Turgot in 1775. And one of the person who organized this was an Archbishop, and he said, "Il faut faire un tout de la pauvreté parce que tout est lié."
Exactly.
Everything is connected, so you have to make one kind of big bundle
Yes.
in talking about poverty.
Absolutely, and we can see that right now with what's happening in the world with climate, it's ecology, everything is interrelated. Everything. And somehow, maybe now there's a chance to see that with all the problems we're having.
Well, sometimes it's fun to see someone come up with a very simple formula. Everyone should read this Raworth's book called The Donut Economy. You know this, but it's really about these concentric circles, and the inner one, the whole, is misery, which you can't have. You've got to have, a kind of social protection around it. But the wealth and the expenditure of resource has a limit against what the environment can stand and managing the environment. So between these limits of sustaining human decent life and not running roughshod over the planet, you have to find a balance.
It has to be balanced.
Yes. Well,
Thank you,
really,
Tom.
thank you very much. I
Thank you,
appreciate
Tom.
this chance to rattle on.
Thank you,
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Erica.
There you go.
I'll make it up. You need a hand. I'm gonna get you out of here. Don't jump on me.